It's the saddest looking time then that you saw in your life. That epidemic broke out and people went to dying, and it was just 4 and 5 every night dying right there in the camps. Every porch that I'd look at would have a casket box sitting on it.
In 1917, as the United States entered the Great War, America's soldiers crossed the ocean to fight the Central Powers. But back home, the United States would soon fight an even deadlier war, the gruesome Spanish flu pandemic that would wipe out entire families, overwhelm hospitals, and send dead wagons through city streets to collect the victims. Could some of these deaths have been prevented if communication had been credible and consistent? Would Americans have then understood the epidemic's dangers and taken steps to slow its spread? Did our government's focus on World War I cause it to deliberately mislead the American public during these deadly days? This documentary will explore how America's newspapers, big and small, confronted the difficult task of spreading the news of a deadly epidemic to its wartime readers. The United States, 1918. Fewer than a third of households had a telephone. Long-distance communication was mainly by telegraph. The public health infrastructure was essentially non-existent, and medical treatments were nowhere near as advanced as today. And although America's cities had experience with quarantines, a critical entity prevented them from communicating that message effectively: America's own federal government. President Woodrow Wilson's 1918 Sedition Act made it a crime to say or print anything the government perceived as harming the war effort. American troops were fighting the Great War, and maintaining morale was critical. Besides, it was thought, a full accounting of the epidemic might embolden our enemies. As a result, when the full-blown pandemic hit the United States in 1918, President Wilson made not a single statement about it, and even his Surgeon General declared, "There is no cause for alarm if proper precautions are observed." Following suit, big city newspapers, the dominant news source in the days before radio, sugarcoated the truth. After all, any bold headline communicating the true dangers of the Spanish flu would be open to attack for undermining morale and inciting panic. Ironically, even the name the Spanish flu evolved from the fact that newspapers in neutral Spain freely reported the epidemic's effects, leading many to believe that the flu originated in Spain, when it did not. The main wave of the Spanish flu first pummeled the United States at Camp Devens, a military base near Boston. By fall 1918, 20% of the 45,000 soldiers at the camp were ill. Within hours, many of them were dead. Camp physician Roy Grist recalled, "They very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia. It is only a matter of hours until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. One can stand it to see 1, 2, or 20 men die, but we have been averaging about 100 deaths per day." It wasn't long before the flu gripped nearby Boston. Its newspapers, however, buried the story among war news, often in much smaller print and as one of dozens of articles spread across each page. This would become the pattern followed by many newspapers. Share stories of victories abroad to boost morale, promote Liberty bonds to raise war funds, and report the flu but downplay its seriousness to prevent panic. In the Boston Globe's October 4th edition, headlines shouted, "Haig breaks through, Huns in full flight." To the left, "Speed loan to whip the Huns, encouraged the purchase of Liberty loans." However, news of the flu, or a grip, was downplayed to a modest article that, despite providing the number of deaths, offered reasons for optimism. "Cases show decrease," it read. But a chart the Globe buried on page 9 revealed the real truth. Deaths from influenza had reached over 2,000 in a city of 700,000, increasing every single day since it first hit. Signs of denial were everywhere. 350 miles southwest of Boston lay Reading, Pennsylvania, a city of roughly 107,000. Its Reading Eagle followed the same pattern of reporting. October 1st, the Allies still successfully smashing foe. 3 days later, Pennsylvania's governor took the drastic step to order all saloons, theaters, and public venues closed to curtail the flu. Yet a page 4 article assured, "No cause for alarm if people cooperate against influenza." 3 days later, with 200 new cases reported in the city, President Wilson called on citizens to buy Liberty loan bonds to preserve liberty today, tomorrow, and forever. Misinformation was also found in the so-called cures for the flu that dotted the Eagle's pages. Dr. George Baer recommended an injection of 1.54 grains of iodine in combination with creosote and guaiacol. Another advocated for plenty of exercise, a clean mouth, skin and bowels, and of course, pleasant pellets, a vegetable pill that would keep the liver and bowels regular. Despite these cures, the flu persisted, and by October 5th, so much of the city was closed that the newspapers reported, Sunday was without a parallel in the history of Reading. It was churchless, preachless, gasless, singless, gameless, clubless, and everything but influenza-less. In the end, the epidemic claimed 500 city residents in what local historians call the greatest civic tragedy in Berks County history. Just down the road in Kutztown, its 3,000 residents got their news mostly through the weekly Kutztown Patriot. It featured the same headlines of the Great War, the same pleas to buy Liberty bonds, and the same ads to cure the flu. But the newspaper did more than that. With honesty and consistency, the Patriot told the story of the community's united efforts to fight the flu. The paper's pandemic story began with brief mentions in early fall 1918, but by October, the flu had gotten so bad that Kutztown's town hall was turned into an emergency hospital. The Patriot called for volunteers to staff it and advertised fundraisers to support the makeshift facility. The newspaper prominently featured a state mandate closing public places and urged residents to follow basic hygiene practices. It listed the sick by name: Austin Road, Emma Snyder. It listed the dead by name: Mr. and Mrs. Central Moser, Henry Adams, Harvey Christ. To boost morale, it boasted that the emergency hospital had passed an inspection by the Berks County Emergency Committee, who couldn't find words strong enough in praise. By February 1919, the worst of the flu had passed, and the Patriot praised the community's efforts. The work is done. Doors are closed. The emergency hospital wrote a shining chapter in Kutztown's history that will serve as a pattern to coming generations. Over a century later, the Patriot's coverage of the Spanish flu remains a model of consistent and credible reporting. It informed, it encouraged, it reassured. Community leaders took the reins when the federal government did not, and in doing so, most surely shortened the duration of illnesses and saved lives. The Spanish flu pandemic that began in January 1918 and ended in late 1919 represents the first collision between modern science and an epidemic, and reveals the pressures it puts on a country engaged in a deadly war. Having taken the lives of an estimated 675,000 Americans, the epidemic stands as a lasting reminder of what happens when a lack of leadership from the federal government leads to widespread confusion, misinformation, and ultimately, more deaths. As epidemiologists have long predicted, the world is once again faced with a deadly pandemic, coronavirus, which as of mid-April 2021 had already claimed over 566,000 lives in the United States alone. In responding to this crisis, infectious disease experts have learned from the world's response to the Spanish flu that short of a vaccine, honest, consistent communication is the key to understanding and ultimately the key to saving lives. Whether information is shared via television or radio or newspapers or social media. Historian John Barry insists it is crucial for government officials and news outlets to retain credibility in the face of any disaster. Falsely reassuring people or depending on the truth to make decisions and formulate plans is the worst possible thing the government and or the media can do. How will tomorrow's historians judge today's media coverage of the coronavirus pandemic? Has the overwhelming trend away from print journalism to sometimes polarizing cable and network television helped us or hurt us? And with more Americans consuming news digitally, how well did we control misinformation on Facebook and other social media platforms? And ultimately, will people simply do what people want to do, no matter how consistent and credible the message? In short, did we gain anything at all from the lessons of the Spanish flu pandemic? Only time and death tolls will tell.